Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, Ukraine and the United States have signed a minerals deal to share profits from the future sales of Ukraine's mineral reserves. The US quarterly GDP has shrunk to its lowest rate in 3 years amid concerns about sweeping tariffs. And South Korea's Supreme Court has overturned an acquittal of the presidential frontrunner in his election law violation case. We start in North America. Ukraine and the United States have signed a minerals agreement that will give Washington preferential access to new minerals deals. The accord also establishes a joint investment fund for Ukraine's reconstruction. The deal came weeks after a heated debate at the White House when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited with the intention to finalize that document. Jim Spellman reports from Washington.
The U.S. Treasury Department says that more of the details will come out in the coming days. But here's what we know at this point. It would give the U.S. access to some mineral deposits in Ukraine. We're talking about things like titanium, uranium, and graphite. But Ukraine would could control ownership and maintain control over those resources. Projects would have to be mutually agreed upon, and then the revenues would be split. This deal also creates what will be known as the United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund. This is a chance for U.S. companies to invest in rebuilding Ukraine after a peace deal is in place. This could be billions of dollars going to U.S. companies through this ability to get in and being involved in rebuilding all of the damage, including infrastructure, that has taken hits during this conflict. An earlier version of this deal was expected to have been signed back in February on the day of that big blow-up between the Ukraine's President Zelensky and President Trump at the Oval Office. It was unclear whether they'd be able to then come to an agreement, but the two presidents met in Rome at the Pope's funeral last weekend, and this seems to be on better footing now. One of the contentious issues that was in an earlier version of this at President Trump's request would require Ukraine to essentially pay back the U.S. military aid that they've been given over the last several years. That does not appear to be part of this current deal. Ukraine wanted to sign this for two reasons. One, because they feel that it's essential to have President Trump and the White House involved in these peace talks. And the second thing is because they feel in Kyiv that if in the reconstruction period after a peace deal when the fighting stops, that if there can be U.S. companies in there doing business, that the U.S. will have a greater incentive to protect those assets, to essentially be a deterrent against a future conflict.
That was Jim Spellman in Washington. Staying in America, the U.S. quarterly GDP has shrunk to its lowest rate in 3 years amid concerns about sweeping tariffs. The new numbers contrast a picture of a growing economy that President Donald Trump has painted. Nathan King breaks it down for us.
The GDP rate contracting in the first quarter, 0.3%. Donald Trump blaming it on Joe Biden. He may actually be right on this, even though the number is weak, though. It actually could have been stronger, but a lot of businesses piled up inventory on imports. Now that counts against GDP, largely because they were worried about tariffs. Now if you look at consumer spending, it was robust, around 3% for the quarter. Now that suggests the consumers doing the same thing, stockpiling ahead of tariffs. But if you hear Trump in his cabinet meeting Wednesday, he did blame Joe Biden.
And I have to start off by saying that's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is the quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy.
And there is something to be said for that. The Trump administration didn't come in towards the end of January. None of their policies really had an effect for a month or so, although tariffs definitely, or the threat of them at the back end, that's for sure. He also said that it would be Biden's Q2 numbers as well. Well, I don't think so. April, May, June is definitely Trump's, but it could actually be better than expected because imports will come down. That will help GDP, especially if tariffs happen, and consumers may spend before prices go up when the tariffs purely hit in about June, July and August. But of course, depressed consumer sentiment, as we've been seeing, could have a negative effect as well. But going forward, remember, everyone's been revising down their growth figures and predictions for the US economy. 1.7% said the IMF last week at the World Bank. IMF meetings, that was down from their 2.4% in January. A lot of Wall Street banks think it's going to be even lower, several of whom have already called what they say will be a mild but definite recession, at least in the second half of 2025.
That was Nathan King on US economic outlook this year. Turning to Europe, the Eurozone's GDP grew 0.4% in the first quarter of 2025, outpacing the US for the first time in nearly 3 years. The economy of the European Union grew by 0.3% in the first quarter. Spain led with a 0.6% increase, while France and the Netherlands disappointed with only 0.1% growth. Germany recorded a 0.2% rise, and Italy exceeded expectations with a 0.3% expansion. But analysts are expecting a stagnant economic performance in the coming months, citing the negative impact of trade tensions. William Denslow has more from Brussels.
This preliminary GDP estimate of 0.4% growth for the first quarter in the Eurozone was twice as strong as economists had expected. Economic growth in the wider European Union, meanwhile, was up at 0.3%, slightly less. The EU's two largest economies, Germany and France, continue to see sluggish growth, ticking up by 0.2% and 0.1% in Q1. GDP for the euro area is up 1.2% compared to the same quarter of last year, and analysts say the growth was fueled in part by the threat of looming US tariffs. This data was collected before the Trump administration's announcement in early April that could see EU exports slapped with a duty of up to 20%. The US and EU share the world's largest bilateral trade relationship, and European Commission officials say negotiations are ongoing to de-escalate trade tensions. The International Monetary Fund downgraded Europe's economic outlook for both 2025 and 2026. Citing those trade tensions, the IMF's new projections are for 0.8% growth this year and 1.2% in 2026. Analysts fear Europe's sluggish economy is hampered by a lack of innovation, with economists calling for more action to make the continent attractive for startups. At the start of the year, the European Commission unveiled its competitiveness compass, with an aim to become a global leader in innovation, decarbonisation and security. The EU describes tariffs as taxes on both businesses and consumers that could complicate the bloc's broader economic objectives.
That is William Denslow reporting from Brussels. In Asia, South Korea's Supreme Court has overturned presidential frontrunner Lee Jae-myung's acquittal for violating the election law. It throws the opposition leader's eligibility to run for president into doubt. The court decision comes after prosecutors appealed a high court ruling last month that acquitted Lee of lying as a presidential candidate during the 2022 election campaign. Polls show that the former Democratic Party leader is the frontrunner with 42% of voters backing him. Xinhan reports from Seoul.
This trial will go back down to the appeals court, the Seoul High Court, where they will come with a verdict based on the decision made by the Supreme Court. Why is this significant? Because, of course, he is a presumptive nominee to lead the opposition's presidential run here. He is the favorite by all accounts, according to the latest polls. But any sort of conviction, more than a fine of $700 would mean he would be, for the most part, ineligible to run for any public office for a matter matter of 5 years. Now, the question is whether the Seoul High Court will come to a ruling or a decision before that June 3rd presidential election is set. The Supreme Court acted very expeditiously after this case was brought to their attention just about a month ago. The Supreme Court Chief Justice saying that given the gravity of the circumstances and just what's at stake is the need for this fast sort of ruling. So either way, if that ruling by the Seoul High Court doesn't come before the presidential election, it would still cast a big shadow over Lee Jae-myung's possible candidacy.
In more developments ahead of the June 3rd election, South Korean acting President Han Duck-soo has announced his resignation. It is widely regarded as a necessary step ahead of his bid for the presidency. Finance Minister Choi Sun-mok will act in the presidential capacity. Han is the second most popular candidate in the polls, with 13% after Lee Jae-myung. The head of Pakistan-controlled Kashmir has called for international mediation amid high tensions with India. The administrator also said his officials are preparing for a humanitarian response in case of any further escalation. The two sides have been exchanging fire following an attack that killed 26 tourists in Indian-controlled Kashmir. Delhi has launched missiles, and Islamabad believes an attack is imminent. Ravinder Bawa reports.
As the pitch of the military rhetoric between the two neighbors gets higher, the Cabinet Committee on Security, or CCS, chaired by the Prime Minister, reviewed the security situation in Jammu and Kashmir. This was the second CCS meet after the attack. On April 23rd, after the first meeting, India announced a series of diplomatic coercive measures against Pakistan. The Prime Minister met with the defense top brass. Quoting sources, the media has reported that in the meeting, the Prime Minister said the armed forces have complete operational freedom to decide the mode, targets and timing of India's response to the Pahalgam terror attack. Earlier in the evening, Reuters reported, quoting sources, that India has objected strongly to unprovoked firing from Pakistan on the border between the two countries in Kashmir during a conversation between their top army officers. It's the sixth consecutive night there has been ceasefire violations across the line of control that separates the two nations. The army has said that they have responded to the firing in a measured and effective manner. After a security audit, the government has closed half the tourist sites to the public. Tensions have escalated with calls here in India for a strong action against Pakistan.
That was Ravinder Bawa in India. Finally, in China, the country is expecting a travel peak on Thursday at the beginning of the Labor Day holiday. Traffic authorities are expecting more than 1.4 billion domestic trips throughout the 5-day period. The Ministry of Transport reports that 62 million vehicles will hit the highways nationwide. The National Immigration Administration has estimated a daily average of over 2 million cross-border trips. Guo Tianqi has observed some trends.
What people are interested in is to have some high quality and in-depth travel experience. Well, we know that Beijing is an ancient city with a lot of abundant traveling resources. So the local government have also launched 10 new routes, especially for the travelers who would like to visit Beijing during the May Day holiday. And these routes avoided those crowded scenic spots and giving people a chance to experience the authentic taste of this ancient capital. Well, some of the routes including visiting the Central Axis, while have some experience of the intangible cultural heritage, and as well as admiring some flowers, and also some routes including sports while you're visiting some Olympic sports venues. Well, nationwide, visiting those off-the-beaten-path destinations is also the trend. And adding that more and more people would like to extend their May Day holiday into a longer vacation, let's say 10 days or more than 10 days. So the long-distance traveler tours are also on the rise. Well, according to some online booking platforms, the plane tickets to Xinjiang, Qinghai, and Yunnan have doubled compared to the same period last year. Let's hear what the travelers in towns have to say.
We traveled from Beijing to Xinyi and found the local food to be affordable. All kinds of facilities are well equipped, and the staff are very warm and welcoming.
We booked the hotel 2 weeks in advance. We mainly want to give our children the opportunity to experience rural life, where they can be surrounded by lush greenery and feel more relaxed.
According to some online booking platforms, a lot of the young people are still the main forces of traveling during the May Day holiday this year, and the people aged from 20 to 40 accounts for 56% of the total travelers. Among all the travelers, more than 50% of them choose to book their accommodations for more than 2 days, which showcases that they would like to arrange more time of their trip and would like to have some in-depth experience.
Meanwhile, China's total film box office revenue for the new releases during the holiday has surpassed 100 million yuan, or $13.7 million. And now recapping the headlines before we go. Ukraine and the United States have signed a minerals deal to share profits from the future sales of Ukraine's mineral reserves. The US quarterly GDP has shrunk to its lowest rate in 3 years, amid concerns about sweeping tariffs. And South Korea's Supreme Court has overturned an acquittal of the presidential frontrunner in his election law violation case. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qizhi. Thanks for listening.